Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a registered psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada, and this is actually my 5th episode. And I'm excited that you're here with me this evening. The focus of this podcast, this episode, is going to be negative bias. It's something that comes up quite often in the practice. People are often confused by why they're so negative. Negative bias is what we call, I guess, in technical term, a psychological phenomenon that explains why our brains focus more on the negative. The simple reason for this is our brain's main job is to keep us alive, and the negative stuff is just more likely to harm us. Now, there's another theory that explains this, sort of expands on this, and they call it the evolutionary negative bias theory. And then that, basically the premise of that theory is that people that were more cautious, skeptical, and focused on the negative had a greater chance of surviving over the thousands of years as we evolved. Therefore, their genes passed on more frequently. This makes sense, especially, thousands of years ago when life was harsh. An optimist that minimized danger may not live very long and then have a tendency not to procreate or pass on his genes. So, and this, there's also a saying I'm quite fond of that I often repeat, which is, our brains tend to remember the bad stuff very well and the good stuff not so well. Or the popular saying we have in psychology, neurons that fire together, wire together. So, in terms of research for this, there was an Ohio State University study I found interesting, which basically showed people pictures to arouse positive feelings, such as sports cars or pizza. Then they showed them pictures to stir up negative feelings, such as a mutilated face or a dead cat. And then they showed them pictures that would produce a neutral feeling, such as a plate or a hairdryer. Then they recorded the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, and which reflects the magnitude of information processing taking place. And what they found was that the negative pictures produced much more the brain reacted much more strongly to the negative, and there was a greater surge in electrical activity when they were showing them these negative, the pictures that triggered the negative feelings. There's a neuropsychologist in California, Dr. Hansen, who explains it as a strategy that he says we have to adopt if we want to change that. At least it's one that we could adopt. He says to change this predisposition to negative, we need to linger longer on the positive to make sure that it registers and have an emotional response while reflecting on the experience, feeling grateful or positive. Now, the longer you do that, the more you ensure that the brain will register. And then, register meaning that it will actually then store in long-term memory. And if we don't reflect on it, often these experiences are just lost. So when you think about the negative bias and you think about it in terms of social settings too, it explains a lot why people who tend to go to a party or a social function may become overly focused on the person that doesn't seem to like them and yet seem to ignore all the people that do like them. And I deal quite a bit with that with clients that are having social anxiety and going to social events. So one of the other interesting things that research found, the Gottmans, who've done a lot of research with couples, found there's a ratio of 5 positive experiences to every 1 negative experience. That if couples have at least 5 to 1, they will characterize their relationship as positive. Now, if it goes below 5 and they have, say, 3 positive for every 1 negative, they tend to characterize the relationship as negative. And in my work that I do With couples, I see this a lot when I'm doing initial intakes, when I'm meeting with them and asking them to just sort of tell me what's been going on. They will often describe their relationship in negative terms. We don't get along. We're always fighting. We're always in conflict. We can't seem to see eye to eye, whatever it is. So that's interesting. So it just, especially with couples, there really has to be a much greater emphasis on positive experiences. 5 to 1 is for some people seems like quite a challenging thing to achieve. I remember there was a basketball coach in the States that had this approach that with his players, that he would, for every negative comment he made, he would have at least 10 positive. I remember when my son Jaden was quite young, I tried that, and I just couldn't get anywhere near 10. I think the most I got to was 5. But it is difficult, I think, to especially with young children. So, although I think it's quite important. One of the strategies that I suggest with clients myself is that when you're confronted with a negative experience, stop and ask yourself, what in this experience is positive, even if it's very small, and try to focus on that, at least to balance out the experience so it's not all negative. For example, if I've been fired from my job, I may reflect on the fact I didn't like the job, or the job was very far from home, or the job maybe didn't pay very much. That will help to balance out, the experience from being just completely negative. So when I was doing some research for the podcast, I found some interesting research. There was one on medical procedures I found quite interesting. So what they did was they presented this medical procedure to people, and they asked to either indicate whether they liked or didn't like it. So when they first presented it to a group, they said the procedure was 70% successful, and most people, not surprisingly, most people liked it. Now they took another group and they took this and they basically said, there's a procedure that has a 30% failure rate, and which is the same thing. And then people, most of those people disliked that procedure. But what I found really interesting was that they took the group and presented with the 70% successful, and they liked it. And then they told them that this procedure actually had a 30% failure rate, which is really the same thing. They then didn't like it. But what was found was really interesting is they presented to the group that was originally given the 30% failure, that most of them didn't like it. If they then came back to them and said, well, this procedure is actually 70% successful, they still didn't like it. And what they refer to this as is a loss frame. And basically this is, similar to the negative bias. It's another way of sort of explaining the specifics around it, and that the brain just tend to resist change when it came to the negative. So I found this was very similar to research that I looked up on the first impressions of people. So first impressions of people's behavior that was negative or considered immoral, even with following that experience, if there was multiple sort of positive experiences with people, they still held on to this negative assessment of the person. And yet, when the first impression was positive, it was much easier to then later have a negative experience with this person and experience the person in a negative, or characterize them as a negative person, or dislike them in some way. So there again, we're seeing the negative bias coming through, that there's a much greater emphasis on the negative. Once the negative has sort of been established, it's very hard to move away from that. I would think that if it did other research to see how many times, how many positive experiences it would take to undo a negative first impression, it would probably be a fair amount. So they also felt that this was because the negative behavior is less common than good behavior. Um, for example, people are, I would think, more likely to hold the door for you than slam it in your face, and that has a lot to do with sort of how people function socially if they don't have any anonymity. What I mean by that is if somebody is in a car or in a large group, we see their behavior change. Whereas if they're on their own and they're sort of like, say, holding a door for you and you're looking at them face to face, it's kind of hard to hide who they are. They tend to be much less likely to be overtly negative to you. I also found some other research that was quite interesting. It was actually kind of showed us that with competency in sports and they focus mostly on sports, that it's actually the opposite. So if a person was to say miss scoring half dozen goals and then score a goal, they would tend to just remember the fact they scored a goal. And I think this is probably true in a lot of areas where I think about examples in business where people might have had numerous business failings and then they had a successful business and they're viewed as a successful business person. So one of the most challenging situations that I encounter, and I guess most everyone has known people, maybe perhaps you even struggle with this yourself, is that when people have enough negative experiences, they often, as a way to try to make sense of it, may characterize themselves as being unlucky or cursed, or in some cases, feeling that they are evil. And this is simply just their way of making sense of what's been happening to them. Now, the problem with this is if you sort of characterize yourself this way, then moving ahead, you can, when something happens that's negative, you're going to then reflect on, of course, this happened, I'm unlucky, I'm cursed, I'm evil, nothing good happens to me, etc. So then you're dealing with what we would call a confirmation bias, where you're everything's being funneled through this negative view of self, this negative view of situations that, and often, I guess, when I encounter people coming to therapy, they're really struggling with this. And so there's a lot of strategies. First of all, we have to change belief systems because these get rooted in people's beliefs and they're completely inaccurate. They've been looking at their life in such a way that they're excluding most of the positive, and then therefore these things make sense. But it's a terrible way to live. But unfortunately, these are some of the things that happen. So, but the negative bias also explains why, and although we always complain about this, why the news focuses mostly on negative news, negative events, is because this is really what people are most interested in. I guess in terms of, I don't have any stats on it, but in terms of like clicks on videos and stuff for different stories and things like this, I mean, I'm sure the ones that are, given what's happening right now with the war and stuff like that, there's a lot more, people liking or watching or clicking on these things than there would be if it was something that was just not negative or not scary or not so difficult, so overwhelming in a sense. So, and although a lot of people will complain about the news is mostly negative, it's like, in the old days, I guess, when we had papers, if you had a headline about, I don't know, somebody doing something positive, it probably wouldn't sell very many papers. Yet if you had some headline that led with some crime that had taken place or something, where a number of people had been hurt or killed, those would, they would sell a lot more papers, therefore make a lot more money. So anyways, so The important thing is, if we're aware of this and we're normalizing this, we're understanding this as like this is how our brains operate. We're not then questioning what's wrong with me, why am I like this, why am I so negative. We can start to understand and normalize that we're all of our brains have a tendency to move towards the negative. Now, what we do know about in terms of like changing this is that meditation, practicing gratitude, will lead you to have a more positive brain. I find that, people that are able to stay in the present moment, who avoid ruminating negatively about the past or being anxious about the future, will feel more positive. This is something that I suggest to clients, that if they can just redirect themselves when they're either in the past or in the future to the present moment, reflect on how they're doing, how they're feeling, maybe feel grateful for something that's taking place, they will be able to feel more positive. But it does take work. If you just let your brain sort of run on autopilot, it's going to sort of skew towards the negative. And so that's why we have to be much more intentional and focused. And there's a lot of books out there, I guess a lot of videos and podcasts and different things talking about how to become happier. A lot of these suggestions I've made were things that certainly will help you feel more positive. We do know that people that are sort of experiencing a lot of negativity will have a lot more cortisol in their brain, and so some of the ways that we get rid of cortisol are like through exercise, as I said, meditation, things like gratitude, laughing, spending time connected with people. These are all activities that also increase positive chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, endorphins. It's very helpful. Certainly we know exercise helps. And so it's just a matter of putting the effort in, focusing on this stuff. There's a lot of information out there if you're willing to look. And don't just sit in the negative. You can change it if you put some time and effort into it. Don't just accept it as this is the way I am. And give it a try.